I want to introduce tonight's speaker, Mike Harris. Mike is a graduate from the University of Mary Washington and the American Military University. He has worked for the National Park Service in Fredericksburg, Virginia, Fort Mott State Park in New Jersey, and for the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission at Daniel Boone Homestead, as well as Brandywine Battlefield. He's conducted tours and staff rides of many of the East Coast battlefields. Mike is certified in secondary education and currently teaches in the Philadelphia region. His first book, Brandywine, was awarded the American Revolution Roundtable of Richmond Book Award in 2014. So please welcome our speaker tonight, Mike Harris.
All right, well, thank you for having me. We have a lot to try to cover here, so I'm going to move kind of quick. Because I used to start this presentation with jumping right into the battle, and then I learned very quickly in the first few months of promoting this book that I was losing people that didn't know how the armies got to this point. So I've tweaked this presentation, which has added some slides to give some background on how the two armies got into a position for this battle. So that's what we're going to start with here. So Germantown is part of a larger campaign known as the Philadelphia Campaign that took place in September 1777. And the campaign actually starts up in North Jersey, as you can see here on these two maps. So all this is in the aftermath of the famous crossing of the Delaware. Everybody knows that story with Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas night and launching an attack on the Hessian outpost of Trenton, New Jersey. That is the December before all this, about 4 or 5 months before this campaign really gets going. After those twin victories at Princeton and Trenton by Washington, Washington camped his army in the mountains of northern New Jersey here around Morristown. And the British went into winter quarters on Staten Island, Manhattan, and along the Raritan River here. So this is how this is where everybody is when the campaign starts in the spring of 1777. Now, William Howe, the British commander, he's going to determine that his goal for that year is to capture Philadelphia. Obviously, the fastest and the shortest way to do that would be to march overland through New Jersey, cross the Delaware River, capture Philadelphia. So the initial maneuverings in May and June of 1777 is Howe marching out from his winter quarters to try to draw Washington out of the mountains. This would only work if Washington obliged and came down out of the mountains, because William Howe doesn't want to attack up through these mountains and try to push Washington out of the way. Washington doesn't do that. He does not oblige. And so Howe's actually starting to march back towards Staten Island when he gets reports that a detachment of the Americans has come down out of the hills to a place called Short Hills. And Howe quickly turns around and launches an attack at Short Hills on June 25th. And that's what's marked here on this map. It's really the only heavy fighting that happens in North Jersey as part of this campaign, because it doesn't really do what Howe needs and get Washington out of the way. So he gives up on this overland campaign, goes back to Staten Island, and starts loading up ships. It's eventually going to be about 267 ships. He's going to put 18,000 personnel on those ships, and he's going to use the British advantage in naval power to shift his army closer to Philadelphia by sea. As they're loading these ships up, Washington really is not sure where they could go. So he's going to initially position his army in the Hudson River corridor with the thought that Howe's going to ascend the Hudson River to link up with an army coming out of Canada. And this is where we are at the end, or by the middle of July, when the British actually depart New York Harbor. So mid-July, the British leave New York Harbor. It's being shown here on this map. And when they do that, when they disappear over the horizon, Washington really doesn't know where they're going. He has no navy that can really track them. So he's got to rely upon spotters along the American coastline, hoping to catch a sight of the fleet moving one way or the other. Because they could be going to Canada, to Boston, Savannah, Charleston, or to Philadelphia. Washington really doesn't know. They're eventually going to be spotted passing Little Lake Harbor, which is roughly where Atlantic City, New Jersey is today. And that's when Washington starts to hightail it through New Jersey and starts to head for the Delaware River to get into a blocking position for Philadelphia. The British will temporarily come into Delaware Bay here at the end of July. And it's not really the purpose of this talk, but there's a decision going to be made there of whether or not to land along the Delaware River or to go back out to sea. And I spend a whole chapter on this in my first book. So if you're interested, ask a question or get the first book. But they choose not to land along the Delaware River. In my opinion, it's a major mistake because at that point, Washington wasn't even in Pennsylvania yet. But regardless, they go back out to sea. So on July 31st, they turn around and they go back out to sea. And you can see here, they're going to spend an additional month at sea, going around the Delmarva Peninsula and up to the upper reaches of the Chesapeake Bay. Washington, while that is happening, does cross into Pennsylvania, and he is going to get his army for most of the time camped along this Neshaminy Creek up here. Now, the same day that the British start to land, let me back up a second here. They land on August 25th here at a place called Turkey Point along the Elk River. It's near where Elkton, Maryland is today. That same day, Washington paraded his army through Philadelphia and started maneuvering down here into Delaware. Once the British have landed, there is some maneuvering through northeastern Maryland and northern Delaware with a relatively minor engagement at a place called Couch's Bridge on September 3rd. It's the largest battle in the history of Delaware. It's about 4,000 guys involved. But you can see here that basically they're going to parallel each other back across the Delaware state line into southeastern Pennsylvania. And that sets up the Battle of Brandywine that takes place on September 11th. So all of that I just kind of gave you a basic overview of is what's covered in my first book. So the Germantown book, which I'm here to talk about tonight, picks up in the aftermath of Brandywine. And so here's the Brandywine battlefield. This is where the British camped after the Battle of Brandywine. They're going to stay there for 5 days. Washington, once he loses the Battle of Brandywine, he needs to get into a new defensive position to protect Philadelphia. The Schuylkill River, which is right here, was the last natural defensive barrier between the British Army and Philadelphia. So he needs to get into a spot where he can block the roads that lead to all these different fords on the Schuylkill River. So in the 5 days the British stayed at Brandywine, you can see here, he retreats up into New Jersey and into what was then a village of Germantown, spends a day or two there regrouping and resupplying, recrosses the Schuylkill River, and marches out into this area known as the Great Valley to get into that blocking position to block the roads leading to the Schuylkill River. The same day Washington's pulling into these positions, do I have it on the map? Yes, I do. The same day Washington's pulling into these positions, as we zoom in here, is the same day the British depart the Brandywine battlefield. And what you end up with, and they're not really expecting this, the roads that the Americans are using to move south are the same roads the British are using to move north. They're not expecting to run into each other. This is September 16th. And you end up with this meeting engagement on two parallel roads that becomes known as the Battle of the Clouds. It's called the Battle of the Clouds because a massive rainstorm, windswept rain, blows through this region, and it ruins the ammunition of both armies. The water gets into the cartridge boxes, and basically renders the guns inoperable. And so never escalates into a full-scale fight because of that windswept rain. But for Washington, all his ammunition's ruined. So he needs to get and find a new source of ammunition. So he needs to get all the way out here pretty far to near Reading Furnace to get a new supply of ammunition. So they have to depart from down here where the White Horse Tavern is, where that fight took place, and get all the way out here to get a new supply of ammunition. Basically leaving the Schuylkill River very vulnerable to the British advance. Luckily, the rain had flooded the Schuylkill River, giving Washington some time, because the British are going to have to wait for the river level to drop before they can cross the Schuylkill. So when he flies out of here to go get new ammunition, He leaves one division behind under Anthony Wayne, Pennsylvania general, to maneuver in behind the British camp and just to kind of keep an eye on the British. And they're going to eventually end up near this Warren Tavern outside the modern town of Malvern, Pennsylvania. We'll come back to that in a second. The day that Washington hightails it out of here, the British move up into what's today Tredyffrin Township and send a column down to Valley Forge, where the Americans will eventually camp for the winter. And it's the only fighting that will ever take place in Valley Forge, and it's on September 18th. And there's a little skirmish here in where Valley Forge Park is today. It's not that big a deal, but the two famous guys that are involved in it are Alexander Hamilton and Light Horse Harry Lee, who will later go on to become the father of Robert E. Lee. They're the two American officers involved. So once the river starts to subside, Washington is resupplied. You can see here he's going to recross the Schuylkill and start to move into blocking positions here along the Schuylkill River. The British are ready to maneuver, but loyalists in the area have informed him that Anthony Wayne is behind his camp. So he needs to eliminate this threat to his rear. So on the night of September 21st into the 22nd, do I have a map on that? He launches an attack on Anthony Wayne's camp. Comes the Battle of Paoli, or the massacre of Paoli, but he eliminates this threat to his rear, and that allows him to maneuver up to the Schuylkill River in where Valley Forge Park is today. Now, he needs to get Washington away from the river. So he's going to trick Washington. Washington's very afraid of a flank attack, especially after the manner he lost the Battle of Brandywine. And when William Howe starts to march west, south of the Schuylkill, Washington panics because all his supply depots are out here to the west. And he can't lose those. They are far more important to him than the psychological impact of losing Philadelphia. So he shifts, he pulls away from the river and starts marching west to protect those supply depots. William Howe has no intention of going out there. He just needed Washington to move away from the river. And so when Washington starts to peel away from the river, William Howe halts, marches back, and they start to cross here at Fatland Ford. That is going to be on September, drawing a blank here. I think it's the 24th off the top of my head is the day they cross. Once they're across, Washington can do nothing to stop the British from capturing Philadelphia. They're going to cross the Schuylkill, and eventually they're going to march down, get my bearings here on this map, down in here to the village of Germantown, establish a camp on September 25th, and on the 26th, they send a column down into Philadelphia to officially occupy the city, beginning a 9-month occupation of the city. And you can see Washington's well out here to the west. Once the British have the city, he is going to slowly move closer and closer to the British, eventually getting his army up onto these Methacton Hills by October 2nd, 2 days before the Battle of Germantown. So I know that's a very brief, basic overview. And there's a lot of stuff I left out, but that's the basics of how they get set up for the Battle of Germantown. So what's Washington's plan? Get a sip of water here. And check on my time. Okay. So Washington has spies too, just like the British have spies. And he learned that the British have made a number of detachments from their main army. William Howe attacked him at Brandywine with just under 16,000 troops. Now, he still has a little over 15,000 troops, but they are not all camped at Germantown. He has sent a very large detachment to Philadelphia under Charles Cornwallis. He has sent a detachment to Wilmington, Delaware, to create a port of a meeting point for the British fleet. So when the fleet offloaded them in Maryland, the fleet had to go back around the Delmarva Peninsula and up the Delaware River. And William Howe needs some place for the fleet to meet up with him, and that's going to be Wilmington, at least at this point. He's also sent 2 regiments south of Philadelphia to get ferried across the Delaware River to capture an American fortification at a place called Billingsport. So all of these detachments from the main army have significantly weakened the force that's directly under Howe camped around the village of Germantown. Now, Washington, meanwhile, he went into the Battle of Brandywine with over 17,000 troops. Now, he lost a lot of guys at Brandywine, but he's replaced them. Maryland and New Jersey militia have joined the army since Brandywine, and a fresh brigade of Continentals from Connecticut has joined the army, basically replacing the losses Washington suffered at Brandywine. So he's fairly equal, at least on paper, to the size of force he had at Brandywine. So he knows he significantly outnumbers the British force in Germantown. And he's going to decide to launch an attack, marching all night on the night of October 3rd, to try to strike this British camp simultaneously along 5 different roads and crush this British camp in Germantown. It's a bold plan. So let's go through the columns he wants to send. And I know I'm listening to the intros that a lot of you aren't local, so I won't bog you down in details of localities, so I don't want to confuse you. If you follow along on the map, you should be okay here. So the column that has the farthest to go is under William Smallwood. This is New Jersey and Maryland militia. They are, you can see on the map the route they're going to have to take. They are meant to strike the far right flank of the British camp. Specifically, the British Brigade of Guards and the Queen's Rangers are what they're going to hit. All right, the next column is under Nathaniel Greene. These are Continental regulars. 4 brigades of Virginia Continentals and a brigade of Connecticut Continentals. Big column. And here again on the map, you see the route they're going to have to take. They are going to hit the right center of the British camp, specifically James Grant's division. All right, next column is John Smallwood's column. Again, 5 more brigades of Continentals, 2 Maryland brigades, and 3 Pennsylvania brigades. Again, you can see on the map here the route they're going to take. They are meant to hit the left center of the British camp under Wilhelm von Kniphausen, a Hessian officer. Following John Sullivan's column is the reserve division of Lord Sterling, a brigade of Continentals, New Jersey Continentals, and a brigade of North Carolina Continentals. They're following Sullivan's guys. They're kind of in reserve. Next group is Pennsylvania Militia, 1 brigade, James Potter's brigade. The division commander, John Armstrong, is also accompanying this column, and they are coming down right along the Schuylkill River to hit the left flank of the British camp, specifically Hessian Jaegers. And then a 5th column, which is the other brigade of Pennsylvania Militia, under James Irvine, is actually going to go on the other side of the Schuylkill River to march down basically opposite of Philadelphia to put on a show here and demonstrate and try to prevent Cornwallis from rushing reinforcements to Germantown. So think about that for a second before we actually get into the fighting. 5 separate columns on 5 different roads, marching all night with no cell phones, no radios, no satellites, nothing to help them, on narrow colonial roads. It would be shocking if they pulled that off, but they did. All 5 columns got to where they were supposed to be, probably within about 15 minutes of each other. It's kind of shocking that they pulled that off with 18th century technology, horse runners and couriers, and they pull it off. So just at daybreak, about between 5:30 and 6 in the morning, Sullivan's column is going to go into action slightly before the others. He's going to be led in the attack by Conway's Pennsylvanians, and they're going to strike the British picket post, which is part of the 2nd British Light Infantry Battalion. All right, just some quotes here. This is Benjamin Talmadge, a dragoon officer with the Americans. It says the troops were put in motion, and in a few moments the firing commenced, and they took the British outpost almost completely by surprise, and the advanced guards of the enemy were driven in with great precipitation. This is Martin Hunter, a British officer with this outpost. He says the day had broke about 5 minutes, but it was a very thick, foggy morning and so dark that we could not see 100 yards before us. Just as the battalion formed, the picket ran in and said the enemy were advancing in force. There are numerous accounts of the fog that morning, which is going to aid the American attack. There was such thick fog, most units couldn't see the units next to them or the units they were shooting at. All right, so once Conway breaks the British picket post, the rest of Sullivan's column is going to deploy, and that's what's being shown here. And then some quotes from this column. This is Enoch Anderson, a captain in a Delaware regiment. It says, we pushed down all fences in our front and marched to the battle. It was a very foggy morning. Bullets began to fly on both sides. Some were killed, some wounded, but the order was to advance. We advanced in line of the division. The firing on both sides increased, and what with the thickness of the air and the firing of the guns, we could see but a little way before us. So imagine you've got fog already, and now you've got black powder smoke from the guns mixing with that fog, making it virtually obscure for any kind of maneuvering. Back to Martin Hunter, our British officer. The British try to fight back. They don't really realize what they're up against here because of that fog. On our charging, they gave way on all sides, but again and again renewed the attack with fresh troops and greater force. We charged them twice till the battalion was so reduced by killed and wounded that the bugle sounded to retreat. Indeed, had we not retreated at the time we did, we should have been all taken or killed, as the columns of the enemy had nearly got around our flanks. And you can see what happens to this battalion. They basically are going to get surrounded by these advancing Americans. This is Adam Hubley, Pennsylvania officer. Says, on our side, the left, our men behaved with the greatest bravery and repulsed the enemy. And with the charge of the bayonet, we took their encampments and pushed them before us hard. This is Friedrich von Munchausen. He's a Hessian officer. He's actually on the staff of William Howe. He's like the liaison officer between the Hessians and the British High Command. And he had been in Philadelphia that morning giving an order, relaying orders to Cornwallis. And he hears the firing off in the distance, and he gets on his horse and he rides like a madman back to Germantown. And he rides into this chaos. And he goes looking for William Howe in this mess. And this is what he writes about it afterwards. He said, the British held off the vehemently attacking enemy for a time, but then had to retreat after heavy losses. I arrived just at that time and was astounded to see something I had never seen before, namely the English in full flight. All right, let's shift over. So there's a lot of success happening here. Let's go over to the American right, where the Pennsylvania militia is coming down towards the British left. Now, if you're not familiar with this area, the Wissahickon Creek, which is marked on the map here, cuts through a gorge. It's very steep on either side of this creek, and there were no bridges here in the 18th century. So when the Americans approached this position, I'm going to be a little honest and give these guys a little bit of due. I don't know how they would have got across here. This terrain is very formidable, and there were Hessians on the other side shooting them. But just I want to give you a couple quotes about this, and then we'll move on. This is John Lacey, a militia officer, and he basically says they didn't do enough. He said, had they equally acted their part with that of the center up here, commanded in person by Washington, and pushed the enemy's flanks with spirit and hilarity, as they ought to have done, then they must have been prevented of forming a second line as they did without opposition. He's basically admitting the militia didn't do enough. And then just one quick account from the Hessian side over here. This is Johann Awald. He's one of the officers with these Hessians. He says the Jaegers, of which only the picket had been engaged, counted just 3 killed and 11 wounded, most of whom died from their severe wounds after several days. All right, let's shift over. The other heavy column that's coming in on Sullivan's left under Nathaniel Greene. So let me give you some quotes from this column. This is Sergeant Charles Talbot, 6th Virginia. It says, we drove them immediately and so continued to drive them. We ran over their dead in great numbers. Oh, why is that not shifting? Uh-oh, it's like we froze here. What happened? Get back. All right, got it. Sorry, froze for a second. Matthew Ankettle, British officer in the 17th of Foot. describes a very deadly encounter, and I'll show you this on a map in a second. The rebels moving on lined a bank and rail under cover of the fog and threw in a most severe fire upon the 4th Regiment, which had been ordered to the left of our battalion and which knocked down almost the whole of their right wing. So Russell's Virginia Brigade, which is marked right here, came down this road. Well, this road was sunken from years of wagon traffic and use. And so it was a depressed road with the road banks higher than the road itself. And along the road was a post and rail fence. And Russell's brigade got into this road and looking under the fog, could see the legs of the 4th Regiment afoot. And they literally laid their muskets on the bottom rail of the fence above them and fired a volley in the 4th afoot and knocked down half the regiment. It's a devastating volley, especially for 18th century warfare, to knock that many guys down with one volley. It's almost unheard of. This is John Marshall, who will later go on to become Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. But he's a young captain here. And he says, the country through which the enemy was pursued abounded with strong and small enclosures, which everywhere broke the line of the advancing army. The darkness of the morning rendered it difficult to distinguish objects even at an inconsiderable distance. So what he's talking about here is all the fences. So Germantown, the village itself, is down here. It's a linear village. All the houses are all along this main road. But all these properties have deep, long properties that extend perpendicular off this road. And all these property owners had put fences that's extended way back off the main road, enclosing their properties. So as the Americans are advancing, there are numerous fence lines they have to negotiate and cross as they're crossing all these properties. And that's what Marshall's referencing there. This is James Grant. He's the British general in charge of this half of the British camp. Now, what I'm about to read to you, he wrote after the battle, after things had changed a bit. He writes, the attempt was bold, but when it came to the push, they failed totally in its execution. I was only uneasy for 10 minutes. This is a bit disingenuous, and it's written after the battle. This entire wing of the British Army is crushed and driven all the way back beyond Germantown Road. That's James Grant's wing. His entire division got crushed and driven back all the way back to here. To say he's uneasy for 10 minutes is a bit disingenuous, but that's what he writes after the battle. All right, this is Joseph Plum Martin, has a pretty famous memoir of the war called Private Yankee Doodle. It's one of the few memoirs of an enlisted guy. He writes, we drove the British quite through their camp. They left their kettles in which they were cooking their breakfasts on the fires, and some of their garments were lying on the ground, which the owners had not time to put on. Affairs went on well for some time. The enemy were retreating before us. And then I think I have one more British quote. Yeah, this is an unknown British officer. We do know he's in the 17th afoot. And he's also describing that volley that took place along the road over here. He says, the enemy's column following the road leading to Germantown, which run along the whole front of the 4th Regiment, and probably not having seen the 1st Battalion, faced to the fence and leaning their pieces on the bottom rail, for it was a hollow road in that part, fired on the 4th Regiment and knocked them down 50 men. That's another officer referencing that devastating volley. All right, let's go over to our last column. This is William Smallwood's militiamen. And just a couple quotes here, then we'll move on. This is Asher Holmes, New Jersey militia. It says the Jersey militia and the redcoats. Some American units were capturing or were wearing captured British redcoats. Hence this reference to redcoats. And the Maryland militia drove the enemy when we first made the attack. The fire was very severe and the enemy ran. And then one quote from a British officer over here, Richard Fitzpatrick, a guards officer. He remembered being surprised by their army coming down upon us and making a most desperate attack. Surprising indeed in every sense of the word, for we had not above 2 hours notice of their advancing and then gave no credit to it. So the million-dollar question is, what went wrong? Everything seems to be going really well, right? If you're not familiar, the Americans lose this battle. So what went wrong? Well, this is what went wrong. So let me back up a second. So that house that we're about to show you is right here. You notice the Americans went past it. All right, you see them driving beyond this position on this map. So let's zoom in now. So here's that house again. Here's a picture of it that I took a few years ago. And what happens is, as all these British units are being overrun, Colonel Thomas Musgrave, commander of the 40th Foot, was panicking. They were getting overrun. They were getting surrounded. He did not want to surrender. And so he and two of his companies, we're only talking maybe 50 guys, we're not talking a lot of people here, ran inside this house and barricaded themselves inside this house. The Americans, in the fog of the smoke, didn't know that and kept going past the house. So here's a painting of Musgrave. What Musgrave's about to do here was so important to him that when he had this portrait painted, he had the house painted in the background. So that house is this house. That's how important what he did here was to him. And the Americans don't know they're in there. This is Timothy Pickering. He's Washington's adjutant general. And he says, I was riding next to Washington down the Germantown Road up here, coming down the road, when they heard the soldiers in front, all these guys up here, a very heavy fire of musketry. And Washington says to him that Sullivan's divisions, it was evident, were warmly engaged with the enemy, but neither was in sight. So they hear all this shooting going on down here, but they can't see it in the fog. And Washington's worried because these guys only carry so many bullets in their cartridge boxes. And if they can't see what they're shooting at, they're going to waste their ammunition. And so Washington tells Pinckney, I am afraid General Sullivan is throwing away his ammunition. Ride forward and tell him to preserve it. Okay. So Pinckney takes off, riding down the road, past the house, to inform Sullivan to stop wasting his ammunition. He says, I rode 300 or 400 yards beyond Chew's house, this house here, met Sullivan and delivered to him the orders. So far, so good, right? Well, it's when he's on his way back that he discovers the problem. So he is now riding back past the house on his way back to Washington. And he says, he writes this after the battle, the first notice I received of it was from the whizzing of musket balls across the road before, behind, and above me as I was returning and after delivering the orders to Sullivan. Now, Pickney's on a horse, or I'm sorry, Pickering's on a horse riding back. And he looks over his shoulder and he sees these bullets whizzing by him. He goes, I could see the blaze of the muskets from the house, whose shot were still aimed at me from the windows of a large stone house, standing back about 100 yards from the road. Now, I realize it's kind of hard to see here. These trees were not here in the 18th century. I'm actually standing, taking my life in my hand, standing in the road of Germantown Avenue. This is a very busy road. But you can kind of see through the trees here the house. This would have been Pickering's view as he's riding back. So he gets back to Washington, and he finds Washington and several other staff officers on their horses in front of this house, which obviously still stands. This is the Bensel house. Here it is on the map. And there's an argument taking place about what to do. There's a huge debate. And basically, the crux of the debate is bypass the house, the battle's not over, keep fighting, or eliminate the threat that is the house. That's the crux of the argument. All right. And Pickering gets back and he says, the officers are discussing in Washington's presence this question, whether the whole of our troops then behind should immediately advance, regardless of the enemy in Chew's house, or first summon those British soldiers to surrender. Henry Knox, the Army's chief of artillery, says, it would be unmilitary to leave a castle in our rear. We must eliminate this threat. That's what Henry Knox says. Pickering responds, we are now in the midst of the battle and its issue is unknown. In the state of uncertainty and so well secured as the enemy find themselves, they will not regard a summons. If you send a white flag up the driveway of that house, they will shoot at it. That's what Pickering says. But they don't listen to Pickering. They're going to send an officer up that driveway with a white flag. And he says, I imagine they would pay no respect to the flag, they being well posted and the battle far enough from being decided. And he was right. The event justified my apprehensions. In a few minutes, Lieutenant Colonel William Smith was brought back with his leg broken and shattered by a musket ball fired from the house. So Smith had walked up the driveway with some kind of white rag, white flag, to try to summon the British in that house to surrender, and they shot him in the leg. He will die from this wound a couple days later. Smith will. Now, I'm going to give the British a little bit of credit. In the fog and the smoke, they might not have even seen that white flag. They might just seen an American walk up the driveway and shot at him. Who knows? All right. So the white flag didn't work, but now you're fully committed. Check on my time here. Okay. They're going to plant an artillery battery across the road from the house, basically right behind where I'm standing in this picture. They're going to put 4 artillery pieces and blast the house. This is a stone house with thick walls. And this is not siege artillery. We're not talking about artillery you would use in a fort or on a naval ship. These are light field guns to accompany infantry. 3 and 4 pounders. These are light guns. They are not going to blow in the walls of a thick stone house. Not going to happen. What that artillery does do is blow the urns off, blow the windows in, blows the front door in. The Grecian statuary that was in the yard, the arms and the heads fly off the statues. It does that kind of damage, but it does not get the British out of that house. So that didn't work. So they now deploy the reserve division. Lord Stirling's division had not been in the battle yet. He's going to deploy with the North Carolinians here and Maxwell's New Jersey troops over here. Now, I can't find evidence that this order is actually given. I actually think Elias Dayton of the 1st New Jersey just sort of does it, and the 3rd New Jersey follows him. But I don't think these orders were actually given. But regardless of whether they were or not, the 1st and 3rd New Jersey, 2 of the 4 New Jersey regiments, are going to charge up the driveway of the house and try to break in through the front door to get the British out of there. Like this. And there's a lot of images of this. Here's one post-war painting showing the Americans in the yard. This is the one from the cover of my book of them trying to get in through the front door. This is a picture I took from inside the house, 2nd story, looking out the windows into the yard. So this is the driveway the New Jerseyans would have charged up. And then this is the view also the British would have had of shooting down onto them. There's another, this is a more modern image of the British defending the inside of the house. But this doesn't work. So they've tried a white flag. They've tried to pound the house with artillery. They've tried to charge the house with infantry, and none of that has worked. So what are they going to do now? Well, they're going to try to set a stone house on fire. I'm sure that'll work. So here's another painting. And this time we see them maneuvering a wagon up to the side of the house full of straw that they're going to light on fire to try to burn down a stone house. That's not going to work either. But one of the guys that's trying to push this wagon is this man, John Lawrence. His dad is Henry Lawrence, who will soon be president of Congress, not long after this battle. For his trouble in pushing this wagon, young John Lawrence will take a bullet through his shoulder, which he will have to recover from after this battle. So that didn't work. None of this stuff's working, but what it is doing, it is making a lot of noise up here. This is a very loud, cacophonous disruption going on behind the lines of the troops up here. And so, guess what that's going to cause to happen? These units up here start to think, hey, maybe we left some troops behind, British troops. Maybe we need to go back there and deal with that. And so units start to peel away from the front line and moving towards this in the fog. And they're going to run into their fellow soldiers and start shooting at their friends in the fog because they don't realize what they're up against. And we also get a Virginia brigade coming over from Nathaniel Greene's column. So you have all these troops converging on the Chew House from 4 different directions, and they're all shooting at each other, killing their friends. Well, guess what? This is going to allow the British to regroup because now the pressure is not on them anymore. And they're going to reform their lines, regroup, and counterattack, and ultimately drive the Americans back out the field. I'm going to give you some quotes about this. Wayne expressed little doubt that the Americans ran away from the arms of victory, ready and open to receive us. One more time. Right on schedule. This is George Whedon, one of the Virginia Brigade commanders. He says, by some means or other, the right wing, he's talking about Sullivan's guys, gave way, which encouraged the enemy to rally and press forward. The left, which he was a part of, shortly after also was broke, and a general repulse took place instead of a victory, the most important had we attained it. This is a British officer again. He says the officers, this is them counterattacking, hallooed out loudly, charge, charge. The enemy turned about, fired, and run forward through the camp. One of my lieutenants was mortally wounded and a very few others. Pursued the enemy who were forming and threw down the arms. So now the Americans are starting to surrender when they had just recently been capturing British soldiers. This is, what's his first name? Thomas Sullivan. He's a corporal in the 49th of Foot. He says, after we fired the first volley, they ran towards the center, leaving the prisoners loose. So the Americans that had captured British prisoners are now letting them loose. Those prisoners quickly reformed and took their arms up, picking their guns back up off the ground, and fired upon the enemy with the greatest ardor. The left-hand company of our regiment took 63 of that party, who upon their approach threw down their arms, the battalion still pushing on. So the tide is completely shifted and the roles reversed. And what about our boy Musgrave inside the house? As the British advance and push the Americans back, Musgrave is able to come out of the house and join the pursuit. And the Americans are going to retreat that night all the way actually off this map, all the way to the modern town of Schwenksville, where Pennypacker Mills is, still there today. Just to give you an idea, some of these American units, between marching all night to fight the battle, and then retreat, marched about 45 miles in 24 hours and fought a battle in the middle of that. But that's how the battle is going to come to an end. Let me just get my plug out there. These are my books. You're more than welcome, if you're interested in a signed copy, to contact me. I'd be more than happy to ship you one. But I'll be happy to take your questions now. I think I did pretty good with my timing. Yeah, I did. All right.
Thank you very much, Mike. You took what is a really complicated battle, something I knew a little bit about, but you certainly made it a lot more easy to understand. And one question I'll ask right now, I mean, obviously you showed pictures of Cliveden, the Chew House. Is that a good place to go to maybe see kind of the remnants of the battle or the battlefield? Are there other places in and around Germantown where you can see very much?
There isn't much left because it's very urbanized now. For those of you that don't live in Pennsylvania, Germantown's no longer a village outside of Philadelphia. It's basically part of the city now. Yeah, you're right, Mike. The property that Cliveden has, it's a National Trust for Preservation site. That's who operates it and owns it. And you can take tours of the house. They probably own the biggest piece of open space in Germantown. Because pretty much everywhere else of that area I was just describing is all urbanized, or some of it's part of LaSalle University's campus. Like the ground that Nathaniel Greene attacked across is LaSalle University now. Yeah, so Cliveden's the best place. It's also one of the few places that's open to the public to get a feel for the battle. Yeah.
Right, and they do a good job of tours there. I know it's probably been at least 6 or 7 years since I've been through, and lots of great 18th century objects that are in the house. So let me go ahead. I'll open up to the audience here and also those at home. Does anyone here in the audience have any questions for Mike? All right, no one from inside. Oh, we do. Oh, great. Yes, sir.
Is that the Chew house that was given rich amounts of land?
So the question was about, you said, can you repeat that again one more time, sir?
Is that the house given to them and rich pieces of land?
So the question was, Mike, do you know if the Chews that had that house also was given land, large amounts of land in Western Pennsylvania?
Well, that's a good question.
Because I think that's a fairly extensive family. My memory of that is I knew that they had large amounts of land in like Maryland, in and around the Pennsylvania region. And I think at the time, was that Benjamin Chew that had the house?
It's his country estate. He also has a property in Philadelphia, proper.
Right.
It's their summer estate, basically.
Because they talk about moving the furniture back and forth between the two estates.
Yeah, I can't say for sure if it's connected to the property this guy's talking about. But I can say that Chew and the family were not there during the battle. He's actually a political prisoner at the time because he's a loyalist. And him and several other prominent pre-war Pennsylvania politicians were rounded up by the Continental Congress and imprisoned. Chew at the time is actually I think he's in Lancaster at the time as a political prisoner. I have to double check that. He's somewhere as a political prisoner during the battle. His property manager, his like caretaker, is the only one on the property during the battle, and writes to him. I have the letter. Writes to him describing the damage of the house. Chew then gets the house back after he's released sometime in 1778, and the damage is so extensive he sells the property. He gets rid of it because he doesn't want to make the repairs. And then the repairs are done by the next owner. Chew actually comes back into ownership of the property. I forget what year. I want to say 1790-ish. I don't remember the year. But what's interesting about the Chews is that his daughter, it's either his daughter or his granddaughter, I think it's a daughter, marries John Edgar Howard, who's a future governor of Maryland. And he's a Maryland line officer in the battle and fought right across the street from the house and ends up marrying a daughter and inheriting the property later in life. Yeah, but I can't say for sure. I know that wasn't an answer to his question. I can't say for sure if they own that property out in Western PA. I can't say for sure.
But that was a very wealthy family, and they had multiple landholders.
Yes. It's definitely possible. I just don't know for sure.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. So, at what point, sir, were you?
Early in the battle. Before the battle took place, Washington.
Okay, Mike, the question was about when Washington did his resupply after the Battle of the Clouds.
Yes.
Where was that? Can you talk about that?
Oh, specifically? Well, I'm going to get a little detail, so I apologize for anybody who's not familiar with the area. If you know the area at all, if you take Route 23 out of Phoenixville and you head west, if you stay on 23 long enough, you're going to come to Warwick Furnace. I think it's a county park, Chester County Park. That is on the very eastern edge of where the Americans camped. Now, where Washington actually set up his headquarters is a place called Reading Furnace, and the furnace owner's house or mansion. That house still stands. If you go, and we're going to really get into some detail. I apologize if you don't know the area, but if you
so that would be Warwick Township was where Warwick Furnace was located.
Yeah, you'd have to go farther.
Antmeal, where Reading Furnace.
Yeah, if you go past Warwick Furnace Park or the county park, and then you'll come to, on the right-hand side, there's a Dodge dealership where actually I bought a car previously, Miracle Dodge. At that intersection where Miracle Dodge is, if you make a left off of 23 and go 100 yards down the road, that's where the mansion house is for Reading Furnace. That's the house that Washington stayed in. And again, I apologize for people that don't know the area, but that's very specifically where they were.
Okay. So
Yeah.
those who had just seen, were Cavalcante, who had escaped from Chester County Prison, and
Yes.
was kind of
Yes.
in that area where he was.
Exactly.
Right. So that might have made more national news for those who don't know the area. Oh, we are getting into the weeds now, Mike. That's great.
That was in the weeds. I apologize for people that aren't local. I apologize. I was trying to avoid doing that during the talk because I didn't want to lose people and those kind of, but that's fine. It was a fair question.
All right. So this is one from one of our online participants. He says, I may have missed it, but what was Washington's opinion on the discussion around what to do with the Chew House and the occupied Chew House?
It's a good question. We don't actually know what Washington thought. Washington's very diplomatic. Much like he gets criticized for losing Brandywine and the way he lost Brandywine, his official correspondence to Congress, he never takes blame. He never places fault. He just straightforward says, for example, Brandywine, he says, there was bad intelligence and we lost the battle because of the bad intelligence. He basically doesn't blame anybody. Germantown, he doesn't even mention the house. He basically, it's a very straightforward, I'm paraphrasing because I don't have it in front of me, but he basically tells Congress in his official report, despite our initial success, the fortunes of war were turned against us and we were not able to hold the field. He doesn't place blame, doesn't give an opinion, and that's the politician in Washington. Now, most of what we know about that debate comes from Timothy Pickering, which is why I was quoting him so much. Pickering, after the war, he is going to outlive most of these guys. So that's an important factor here. Pickering writes after the war, he gets into a series of correspondence with a guy writing a book about Nathaniel Greene. And this guy writing the book about Greene wants to know details about battles. And he's corresponding with Pickering, asking him questions. And these letters are going back and forth in the 1820s. And there's dozens of them. And in several of these letters, Pickering's detailing this discussion, this argument. Now, granted, it's Pickering's version. Because nobody else that was involved, that Pickering claimed was involved, talks about the debate. Knox's account of the battles in a letter to his wife, and he doesn't even mention it. There's another guy, I think it's Caleb Gibbs, who's the commander of Washington's Life Guard. He talks about it, but he doesn't take sides in the matter, but he does discuss what went down in a letter, or that's in his diary, I think is where that is. So no, we don't really know what Washington really thought. Again, that was a long-winded answer, but hopefully that addresses it.
No, well, thank you, Mike. That gives a great background on why we don't really know. So one other question here from the room, and I think we'll go ahead and close things up. So a statement, but also a question, Mike. Do you think if they would have bypassed the House, the outcome would have been different?
Well, it's what if. That's a great what if, right?
Right.
Because I get that question a lot. What I think they should have done is stick a regiment at that house and just don't let the British out. And then all those reserve units that hadn't got into the battle yet could have been shifted to the front with fresh ammunition and continued to fight. Now, what could that have changed the fight? Hard to say. I also don't think, to take it another step, a lot of people ask, what was Washington's goal? Because Washington never says what his goal was, other than to strike the camp. I think his goal was to drive not to defeat the British, but to drive them back, the whole army, into Philadelphia. If you're unfamiliar with the geography around Philadelphia in the 18th century sat on a peninsula formed by the Delaware and the Schuylkill rivers. There was no Philadelphia on the other side of the Schuylkill River like there is today. I think Washington wanted to drive them back down onto that peninsula and then block off the mouth of the upper part of the peninsula. Because at this point, the British or the Americans still controlled the river. The Americans controlled the Schuylkill River and they controlled the Delaware River through fortifications. It's what my new book's going to talk about in more detail. If they had been able to drive them down and then block off the land side of the peninsula and maintain control of the river, they could have starved them out, just like they did at Boston. They could have besieged Philadelphia and starved them out. I think that was the goal. He never comes out and says it, but I don't think he was strong enough or his army good enough to defeat the British. I think they just wanted to push them back, and they almost pulled that off. That's just my take on it. Washington never actually says. That's my opinion on the whole thing.
Okay, well, thank you, Mike.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for this lecture. I especially want to thank our speaker, Mike Harris, for his presentation, and Kathy Donaldson and Bruce Chadbourne for helping to organize our virtual talk, and also all of our troubleshooting with the technology, because this was our first virtual talk in which the speaker was also virtual. So thank you all for coming out and watching us today. I also want to thank the Friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace who sponsored this program, and Cornwall Manor for allowing us to use this wonderful space. So please join us for our next and final lecture of the year on Tuesday, November 14th, when Dr. Corey Young will give a talk, Bound by the Furnace, Iron Slavery in Early National Pennsylvania. This will again be an online lecture only. And since this watch party worked, we'll probably do that again as well here at Cornwall Manor. So just a reminder, the museum is open Friday through Sunday for tours. So please check our website for details and tour information. So please stay safe and have a good night.